means a patient is no longer considered infectious.
All right, there we go. Let's do this again. From the Cure Task Force, I believe he's also part of the Surgeon Cell out of the National Guard, Sergeant Fernando Esteves. Good morning, Sarge.
Off the day, Chris. How are
Good morning.
you?
Good morning. We got Sabrina here, too. It's her birthday, by the way.
Off the day, Sabrina. Happy
Off the
birthday.
day. Thank you.
So, Sarge, obviously you've worn a lot of hats, and I just think it was kind of interesting when I saw you in the press conference. I had to kind of do a double take. I was like, wait a minute, is that former Senator Fernando Esteves up there?
Yeah. I was activated. I came on board on the 1st to provide assistance. So with regards to medical planning and logistics specifically, which is part of my bread and butter when I was active duty in the Army.
Right, and so I guess just first of all, Sergeant, if you could talk about what responsibilities you have and what what do you kind of do with the Surgeon Cell and how it relates to the COVID response.
Sure. So I'm the medical operations and logistics coordinator. So what I do, kind of from a macro, if we go back to what the cure was intended was to unify and coordinate the different elements, both public and private, that we have in terms of medical assets on Guam in order to have a unified response towards COVID. And so what I do is I coordinate those efforts. I track progress as for both operations and logistics, and then focus on executing the different initiatives that was mainly part of the initial and medical surge plan that we were working towards.
I guess.
Okay, can you just kind of speak English? Just break that down because I'm not sure what you just
Do
said.
you have permission to
like
speak English, Sarge?
So in the simplest way, right? There were challenges that needed to be met. So there was the expectation of a large surge of medical patients. And so part of medical operations is understanding in detail what Guam's current capacity is, and then working to execute the plans on how to expand that to get as close to, if not to meet, the medical capacity challenges, really to save lives ultimately. And so it's coordinating all of those pieces and executing all those plans and individual actions that need to happen.
And so you also, and I guess you're responsible for procuring, getting all the equipment that's needed medically for the response to COVID-19, right?
I mean, that's part of it. So the different agencies and even the private facilities all have their own medical materials sections. And so, right off the bat, we encourage them to continue to use their vendors to keep processing. But what I do is I track the daily numbers for every individual facility. I use CDC methodology to calculate their predicted burn rate, so I can see when they would or could potentially run out. And then as well as I source and verify other vendors to add onto the list for additional orders through FEMA, Homeland Security, and such.
Right. So you're the guy who's keeping track of how many PPEs we got and how many
test
kits and all that
Correct.
stuff. Right. Yeah.
Correct.
Can we just go back to this customs thing? There appeared to be a lot of confusion about what that order actually enabled the government to do. So could you just maybe unpack that and maybe offer some clarity? Because I've asked to get Chief Pareto on, but he hasn't had the availability, at least for this station. So if you could, Sergeant.
Sure. Well, I can't speak. He'd be a better individual to ask in terms of the enforcement of that and, the government's ability to confiscate. What I can say is to date, I'm not aware, as the logistics coordinator, of any PPE that's been confiscated by the government. But what I can directly speak to is that, one of the big things is and this is a national issue, is the safety issue regarding importing counterfeit items. Because they can really be problematic and a danger to the community in general and the medical community more specifically. And all of those things could have a big negative impact on our medical capacity.
Mm-hmm. You said PPEs. You weren't aware of any PPEs that were confiscated? Is that what you said?
Correct.
What about like test kits or other sort of medical supplies?
So as far as test kits go, there was one set of test kits that were brought in because of concern that they might be counterfeit. And so part of what I've been doing, I've been working, and I made myself available to different medical supply vendors, locally and internationally, to make sure that those products are vetted beforehand. So that one in particular, I guess the purchaser was under the impression they were FDA approved, but the manufacturer was a bit deceiving in that it didn't have U.S. FDA approval, only Philippine, which according to U.S. FDA is not authorized for use.
And how many test kits are
in that quantity?
Yeah.
I want to say there were about 2 boxes. I can go back and look at the inventory to get that exact amount.
Like 2 big boxes or like 2?
No.
So are we talking like hundreds or thousands?
I'd say closer to about maybe 1,000.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But again, these are also, at least these specific tests are IgG, IgM, which are not definitive types of tests.
Okay.
Do you know what happens to them?
I don't.
That would be customs.
Yeah, that would be above me to make the call what happens to them.
But
And
they're
so-
not allowed in the Guam.
Correct.
Okay.
And the reason for that is because they don't have the FDA, either the preliminary or any kind of approval from the FDA, the EUA.
I think the easiest way to say it is yes, they don't have any approval from the FDA. There's really that's kind of a misnomer. There's not really anything. There's no such thing as a preliminary or pre-approval. It's either approved by the FDA under their regular auspices, their regular operations, which is the most stringent in the world, or under the emergency use authorization.
Are any test kits officially FDA approved?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I want to say on that list there's maybe about 40 manufacturers, and almost daily there's a new manufacturer of tests.
Wait.
And
I mean,
so
are they
you saying-
officially FDA
Or
approved
do
or
they have the
EUA?
emergency use?
Oh no, there are no test kits for COVID-19 that are officially FDA approved.
But what they do have is the emergency use authorization, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Okay.
So that's are you able? Could we talk about these South Korean test kits? I mean, you as the logistics officer, I'm just wondering, logistically, are there any of these South Korean test kits? Because I know there are people trying to push it for the mass testing, but are there any? Because I'm confused. I've gotten the links, but I've been told by doctors on the Physicians Advisory Group that if you go to the FDA website, it's really hard. I mean, it's hard. It's a hard website to navigate. It's huge. But are there any South Korean test kits that have the emergency use authorization from the FDA?
So of the 3 that have been highly publicized, one received theirs on the 18th, and so by the next day on the 19th, I was in communication with them to try to get more detail into their product, and then also look at the potential of acquiring them. And so yeah, those discussions started right away. I monitor and I'm in contact with the FDA as needed, but I monitor that site to look at new listings multiple times a day.
I see.
Are any of the test kits? Do you monitor the test kits that are like coming in from FEMA?
I do.
Are any of them from South Korea?
Say again?
Are any of them from South Korea that they brought in?
No, to my knowledge, none of the test kits that have arrived from the CDC or FEMA were of that batch from South Korea. At least those that have been publicized. They've been for the existing machines that match the current ones we have that were provided by FEMA. So like the Abbott Gene Expert, for example, the ABI 7500, and so those those testing machines that were provided by the federal government, they have been supplying and supporting with test kits and other consumables to utilize them.
How many test kits did we get from from FEMA?
So I'll go back. I'm not in the office right now, but I can get that total list from you.
I mean,
and Public Health will have that as well.
Right. So, I mean, we're talking hundreds, thousands, maybe just ballpark?
Yeah, I'd say at this time hundreds, but they're wrapping up their manufacturing,
right.
And at least what I can say, and Public Health is more in direct communication with the CDC regarding what they're supplying. We're expecting a steady supply from them ramping up. And so you have to understand, when this whole thing started, if if you stay up to date on the CDC pandemic plans, FEMA, all of the studies kind of showed the same scenario, that there would be, an approximate 3-month delay before manufacturing catches up. And so based on all of those studies and guidelines when we first started, that was the initial target goal, was to make sure logistically, in terms of supplies, PPE, equipment, testing, we were getting to a point where we're going to meet that capacity and to hold the line until manufacturing catches up. And when you monitor the FDA and in terms of what's being recently approved under the emergency use authorization, those numbers are ramping up quickly. And I'll give you an example with the masks, the KN95s. Generally, they're not accepted at all, but those certain companies that meet those specifications under the FDA, I want to say about a week and a half ago, there were 3 manufacturers in China that met that. Today, there's about 78 manufacturers that meet that with those masks. Same thing with the test kit. And so if looking at it from that point of view, you can see manufacturing is catching up, and a lot of these supply chain issues are going to be alleviated, each day that passes by.
Sarge, could we just maybe this, and I don't know if you can speak on this, but just specifically with there was an effort by Speaker Tina Munoz-Barnes to and former Senator Dennis Rodriguez to conduct mass testing with South Korean test kits. The ones that they have you researched the South Korean test kits they're talking about, and do they have the EUA or not?
So that particular test, the Solgen, does not have an emergency use authorization. When that was brought to my attention and I was asked about that, I immediately contacted the FDA, and I actually called them twice at different parts of the day to make sure that the answer was consistent. And so there is no EUA for the Solgen, and I believe, I want to say, more than a week ago when I contacted them, and I've been monitoring ever since. Now, what they were able to confirm is that an application was submitted, but they make no guarantees that just because an applicant submits an application, that the FDA is going to grant an authorization, because there's a burden of proof that their product says it's going to do what it's going to do. And so generally and typically there's about like a 2-week time frame that they say that they work to get an answer on an authorization. And so, we're in communication with them to get any updates for additional testing capacity. Right,
because there was a letter that had come out from the Speaker's office, and it seemed to imply that they did have the EUA, but then there was something about they had checked the website, and it was kind of a little confusing. But
it did. So I can speak on the first test coming out of South Korea of those 3 was the Osang, which came out on the 18th. And it's important that people understand the context of texting. I think there's a huge misconception that all we need to do is get the test kits and then we can run the test, but that's very, very far from the truth. So for example, when I was in communication with the manufacturer, their minimum order quantity was 100,000 test kits. That's the minimum you can purchase. 100,000 tests, which seems like an easy sell. But when you actually do the logistical portion and put the work behind it, it would take us, with our current testing capacity and the machines that are compatible with that specific test, it would take us 4.5 years to use those test kits, and the shelf life is only 1 year. And so part of what we do is we go and we look at these different offers, and then we see, what are the limiting factors, what are the different courses of action to potentially make this happen. And so, I use that example with the one ABI 7500 that's compatible. It would take 4.5 years running it 24/7. And so many factors go into that. Do we have enough, and can we procure enough VTM, viral transport medium, to process all those tests? And there's also a nationwide shortage of that. We have test kits right now that we're still waiting on VTM in order to utilize those test kits, and that's been an ongoing thing. And so from a logistics point of view, we have to match up certain things. 1, the testing machine. 2, the test kit that's compatible. 3, the viral transport medium and for the specimen collection and transport. 4, a certified lab technician. 5, a certified lab that machine can run in. and then the sixth one being the reagents required and needed in order to make sure that the machine is calibrated so we don't get false and bad readings.
Sarge, maybe just a short answer. Is the plan that Speaker Barnes, the plan that she and former Senator Dennis Rodriguez, that they offered out using these, South Korean test kits, is it logistically impossible to execute that level of mass testing that they're talking about?
You're talking about testing for the entire island.
Right. I'm just talking about the proposal that has been put forth by the Speaker and former Senator Dennis Rodriguez from the Speaker's Physicians Advisory Council.
So Chris, I did look over the proposal. As to whether or not it's impossible or not, would not be my call to make. Again, I'm an activated uniformed personnel, and if I'm told to make the impossible happen, I'm gonna have to find a way to make the impossible happen. So I wouldn't be the appropriate person to ask whether or not that's something that can be executed because it's on the policy side.
Right. I mean, so
sure.
I just think we beat this issue to death. I think it's done. It's not going to happen.
What I can say is that in order to even maybe assess the feasibility, right now we have a lot of things ongoing, but I think from my clear understanding of the governor's intent regarding the use of FDA approved either through the regular process or emergency use authorization, that intent has been made clear to me. Now, so what I can say is, in terms of visiting that plan, it's going to be contingent on the type of test and what test they're using. But going back to one of the logistical challenges that could potentially pose with that is that any test that has an emergency use authorization also has requirements on how that test is processed. So, for example, each one of those EUAs will make the determination whether it needs to be in a CLIA certified lab that can run and is certified for moderate complexity testing or high complexity testing. So that's another thing that we have to match up. Also with the certified lab technicians that are going to be able to run those tests properly. Because again, just having a test is one thing, right? Being able to use it is a whole nother discussion.
Right. I think it's a dead issue. We're not going to see these South Korean machines or whatever. We're going to stick with our ABI and our Avid ID or BD.
No. But what I want to say, Sabrina, it's not that it's from South Korea. I mean, because again, the Osang is a South Korean-made test,
right?
And there are Chinese-made tests as well. That has nothing to do with it.
It just hinges on the EUA, right?
Correct.
Right.
And not just the EUA, but the requirements in that EUA that need to be followed.
Okay.
Again, so the lab requirement being one specific one, that's always up and definitely a logistical headache.
Oh no, I'm just saying we've got these 6 testing machines these machines. So it just sounds like we're going to stick with this. We're going to get the test kits that are compatible with this.
It's clear that the governor has her plan to execute. Sarge, I want to go back to what we first talked about. Is you said that you were responsible for building everything up for this projected surge. And what is this projected surge from the first major trajectory that Dr. Cabrera had presented? And then I guess my follow-up question would be, if so, how have we retailored our approach given that we now have a new trajectory plan?
So that I can definitely speak to. So in terms of what the trajectory can be is still a possibility, right? It's still a very plausible worst-case scenario. And so, again, we want to plan for the worst and hope for the best. So the plan on how we were going to execute based on what Guam has in terms of medical assets, facilities, supply, resupply, equipment, personnel, the plan is that we now still acquire those things that we're short on, such as ventilators, for example, stockpiling PPE, and we look at how can we now take this plan and prepare for a second surge. Not necessarily have everything stood up, have tents outside like we're just waiting, but to be able to turn it on very quickly if we see that surge arise, right? So it's taking a lot of the existing product, making some minor modifications in terms of execution dates when we were going to have this stuff ready to go, and then pull it back and make sure that everything is sourced. There's a plan. We understand all the shortfalls, and we're taking those lessons learned. So really, what it'll come down to is we can almost turn on the switch, and we'll be ready to increase our medical capacity greatly.
Mm-hmm. All right. I wanted to ask about since you do work with the supplies. Have you been told to I guess slow down on ordering these VTMs because of the news about the Avid ID devices and how these VTMs, these viral transport medias, could produce false negatives?
So the VTM, that VTM issue specific with the Avid ID now. Right. But the other machines that we have that run PCR molecular tests, it's still absolutely very crucial. So, I read that documentation, and it really is specific because the Avid ID was designed to be a point-in-care type of test. Really, their bread and butter and their best use is, for example, in the emergency room of a hospital, so a patient can be cleared very quickly on the spot before, and so that the staff and the medical staff and workers are aware whether the patient is positive or not.
And so we spoke with Dr. Cabrera earlier, and he said that with the Avid ID, one of the decisions that they're really looking at moving forward is placing these swabs in a saline solution, and then I guess that would eliminate, the potential for the false negatives.
Correct. So, we're looking at that I'm looking at that with all of the individual machines because depending on the specimen, you can put it in a VTM, a viral transport media, a universal transport medium, or a sterile saline type solution. And so remember, this is, again, a lot of it is very ongoing. And things like what we saw with the Avid ID are exactly the reason why things normally go through a very stringent FDA process. And so, there's been a lot of relaxation on a lot of those policies with regard to the emergency use authorization. But again, as much as possible, that golden standard is maintained throughout the crisis, and we don't devolve into panic buying without any thought process behind it in terms of logistics or feasibility. Because what I can say confidently is I don't think anybody would be happy about 100,000 test kits sitting around not able to be used.
They'd probably be pretty pissed off about it.
It's in a crisis, it's almost a lose-lose situation. But the work continues, and yeah, I'm here to do a job, and I'm just going to keep doing it to the best of my ability. Me and the team.
How are these medical supplies and equipments and PPEs being purchased? Do we go direct to the vendor, or do we go through like a local company that brings them in?
There's multiple avenues. So as I stated earlier, public health, GRMC, GMH, for example, and even the private clinics have their own medical supply chains, right? And so what we do know is that in this crisis, what people and what medical material suppliers are used to having is they would place a large order. It may be on back order, but that order would get filled, right? So there's a lot of stress and anxiety in that chain because it's very out of the normal. Luckily, having been in the Army and deployed in austere conditions, I'm very used to those types of situations. And so what we want to plan around is what's kind of called a trickle-in type of supply economy, where it's not necessarily we're going to get our bulk order of 50,000 masks or 100,000 masks. We're going to order and source from multiple vendors, and as they parcel out and partially fill all those orders, we need that trickle-in effect to match our daily usage. And if we do that, then we're never going to run out, right? It's almost like you put in $5 in your gas tank just to get to where you need to go, and then you put in another $5 to somebody who's used to filling up their tank when they need to. And so that's probably the best analogy that I can use for that. So that's one way we're doing it. The other way we're doing it is also using the emergency authorization to now look at, and part of what I do is I look at a lot of the common items that are needed, N95 masks, gowns, for example, and we source them from larger manufacturers, vet the product and manufacturer, and then we look at doing a bulk order. And then when that comes in, then it gets divvied out, because some again, with the supply chain, some are able to provide small quantities. Others will only sell to you if you buy in large volume. So that's one thing we're doing from the macro, from the government point of view, is to order. So we're doing this from many different angles, as well as providing support and answering questions for local vendors who want to potentially bring in supply, or
right.
who need to vet new manufacturers. And so we're working it two ways with the government, as well as the federal government, and then also the private sector.
Right. So they call you and they're like, "Hey, Sarge, can we get this? Is it FDA approved?" And so they're basically making sure it's not going to get seized. So they're kind of clearing it with you preemptively.
Sure. And you would really be surprised, Chris, the length that some of these counterfeit manufacturers would go to try to get their products sold. I mean, we've seen fake registration numbers, certificate numbers, faulty tests. It's all they will go through great lengths to really deceive you. And so, there's an importer's guide that I developed that I know is getting vetted right now. And then the idea is that we kind of publish that out, update it constantly, and make sure that everybody has access to it, so that government purchasers, private vendors, and purchasers, as well as consumers, most importantly consumers and healthcare workers, can go and identify whether this product is valid or not. Because there's a very big danger with a counterfeit product, right? Something like an N95 mask that's supposed to guarantee a certain amount of protection is critical for a healthcare worker, right? Because if we lose a healthcare worker, we lose a huge part of our overall medical capacity, because it's more exponential, right? And then from a consumer standpoint, if you're buying an N95, right, or an equivalent, for Tan Maria, and it doesn't provide that protection, that's a huge issue right now and moving forward.
All right. Well, I think you're very thorough. Thank you so much. Anything else you wanted to add?
No, again, if there are vendors out there, medical supply vendors, and they need assistance, my contact number, they can get it at Adaloop. I'm hoping it should be on a website soon, so they can reach out, but I've already had people reaching out. And so, just hope everyone...
Wait. You're working out of Adaloop?
Correct.
Oh, wow.
How's that? I mean...
so it's kind of a ghost town up there, right?
Right,
In terms
yeah.
of only the essential people are up there, so, they were nice enough to give us a workspace to operate out of
right.
within there. So it's a facility.
And I know you're uniform. You got the uniform on right now, but I think it's interesting that given obviously your background as a former elected leader, that we now see you in the uniform, and that's where you kind of just put everything aside and you got that job to do, right?
And working out of Adaloop.
Yeah. No. Absolutely.
Stop it, Bree.
I'm a National Guardsman. The governor is my commander in chief,
Right.
and I have a duty, and really, I'm very happy to support her and the island and the people of Guam any way that I can. I really do believe it's a great honor to be able to bring the experience that I've gained over multiple deployments and years on active duty serving the federal government and serving, the overall federal mission. But to be able to do that for Guam and the island, it's the greatest honor. It really is.
Well, thank you, Sergeant. And
Thanks,
yeah,
Fernando.
definitely thank you for so thoroughly unwrapping a lot of that information, especially in English. We appreciate that.
I appreciate it, Chris, and happy birthday, Sabrina.
Thank you.
Okay, there you go. Take it easy, Sarge.
Be safe.
Okay.
Yes. Wash your hands. Sergeant Fernando Esteves of the National Guard there. Of course, he's on the surgeon cell. Kind of leading, it sounds like, the COVID-19 response on Guam, and I thought it was interesting, and that what he mentioned about they were procuring supplies and building our capacity based on that first trajectory that came out, the doomsday one, and then they've since kind of moved towards having these things ready, and the metaphor used was that we would flick a switch and be ready. So it's good to know someone's got a plan.